we're looking at using pandas to analyze data. Now, the big thing is, where do we get all these data? So far, I've been providing data files. This is the first week we've looked at data that has come from somewhere else. And it was a data file of taxi data from Manhattan. And there are places you can go and get data. One of the best places is the U.S. government. There's tons of data sitting out there. We're going to look at that, how to get that. In a local or organizational situation, one of the places you might want to be getting it is from a database. And so we're going to look now at how to connect to a database. In most instances, when you connect to a database, it's going to be a relational database, and you're going to need to know SQL to get the data. Now, again, for the most part, you're going to have to write simple selects because the database administrator would have created views to do all the complex joins, and you just do a simple select to get the data, usually. But you should know some SQL. I'm not teaching you SQL in this class. You should go out and learn some SQL. I'm going to show you how to do the connection to the database. I'm going to have some SQL in here. It's fairly straightforward. Again, the select you should know. But again, you're not going to need it for this course, but you should know the SQL commands. Everybody should know simple select SQL commands. The other thing is, when we read the data in, we're going to read the data into, using Python, we're going to read it into what's called a cursor. And cursor objects are used in many languages, and they're used in most of the time when you're connecting to some sort of database. And a cursor object allows you to issue commands in the native language, in our case Python, and it will then send it to the database. And the database, a relational database especially, usually returns a table of data. And the cursor object is designed to take this table and then store it in memory and allow you to process the data row by row by row. Instead of having to have this each individual language come up with some format for storing this table and moving through it, the idea is to come up with this more universal term, which is called cursor. Similar to like if you were talking about an array. It's slightly different in every languages, but you know what you're talking about when you're talking about array. And that's the same thing we're going to be doing here. We're going to be making a cursor object and then reading the data from the cursor object. And the cursor object is linked to some SQL command. I'm going to start with the other thing we're going to work with is I'm using SQLite. SQLite is a database in a file, basically. It's a relational database that sits in a file. You do not need a database engine for it. So if I give you a database, an SQLite file, you need to have SQLite, but the database is not it's not a database engine you have to install and have running on your system. So it's a very, very lightweight form of a relational database. So there's no database running in the background here. So I'm bringing in SQLite 3, and then I'm making setting a connection using the connect command to a SQLite database called people.db. I am then making a cursor from that connection and calling it cursor. And then we execute this SQL command, and this is the SQL command that will create the table scores in the people database. And then we're going to commit it, and then we're going to close. And unfortunately, I might have done this already, so we might get an error. No, I cleaned it up. Good. So we've cleaned it up, and we don't get an error. We have created the table. There's no data in the table yet. We just created the table. We'll look at the next one. We do the exact same thing. We make the cursor file. But now the command we want to execute is insert. And we're going to insert into the table scores. And the values we're going to store is 1, 101, 300, and 1. Then we're going to commit that, and then we're going to close the connection. And so now we run this. Now we have one record of data that we stored into the table scores. Who wants to really, if you're processing a bunch of data, you might do it this way. More than likely, you'll have a bunch of data that you want to store into the database. In this case, is Python, so we're going to use a list. What else would you use for Python? We make the connection, we make the cursor, we have a list here. This is just a straight Python list, and inside of each list is a tuple of data. This would be equivalent to a row of our table. And then we have a slightly different format for the insert for our executive. We are going to, again, it's execute many here instead of just execute. We have insert into scores values, but instead of putting the values, we have the question marks. Each question mark matches up to an individual field in our row, and then we have the list after here. And the list, each item in the list is a tuple that has each one of these items correspond to each one of these question marks, which correspond to each one of the fields in the database. So far, you're like, oh, I don't need to worry about this, and you really don't need to worry about this unless you're going to be actually inserting it or creating and modifying the database. But we're going to run it anyhow. Sure enough, we now have lots of data in there, and you're like, how do I know I have lots of data in there? Well, I have select star from standings, and you're going, well, we haven't done standings yet. Notice I now have a different database here. I have one all set up. I have views and everything set up in it. So I just wanted to show you how to do the inserts, but here we have one. And I'm going to select star from standings, and as it so happens, there is all the data that's in standings, and actually standings is actually a view, not a table itself. But this is how you might start getting data. Notice we have the cursor here, and the cursor is result. If you want to process that cursor, again, move row by row by row through, we just use a for loop, just as if it was a list, and we do print rows. So we do for rows in results, so that would be for row in the cursor. We then print that down, and then we commit that, and we close it. All right, so same thing. We have our complex database here, relational database here. We make a cursor. We do the select asterisk from standings. We set that into result. Notice now, just like I was talking about, that row is equivalent to a row of data. We can think of that as a tuple, and we can do print row 2, which would be 0, 1, 2, which would be the third item in our list, in our records, and there we are. We do 0, 1, 2. You can see that the third column of data is their last name, and sure enough, there is all the last name data from our database. Now, if we do the same thing from standings, we have we do our scores, make a data frame. Instead of just printing it out, we can make a data frame. Now we're getting somewhere. Because what we really want to do is read data from a database and forget about Python and get it into Pandas so we can actually do some cool stuff with it. And sure enough, we can easily convert our selection from a database into a cursor and take that cursor directly and turn it into a data frame. It is a data frame. We can do a head on it. We can print the whole thing, and then we close the connection. And there it is. Pandas. In number 7, check my notes here. Instead of doing just looking at the head to make sure you have all the data, you can look at the shape of your output, and you can see there's 47 records by 8 rows. And this is very common to do when you execute a select and read it straight into a data frame. You want to check to see if you got all your records and all your columns. So by looking at the shape, you can see the data that you've got. Now, it could be empty data, but at least you have something there. And last but not least, you might see something that looks a little bit different. We still have a when we run, we have our cursor object here, which is this. You can see a result is the cursor object. You can't print a cursor object. So when you say print cursor, you get this. If you want to print a cursor object in Python, you're going to have to use your for loop. Of course, we can also convert it into a data frame. And if we convert it into a data frame, you can see we have a nice little data frame there. We're just printing the head of the data frame, but we have the whole thing. But the original cursor is still there. So even though you convert the cursor, you don't convert the cursor into a data frame. You copy the data from the cursor and then put it in a data frame. So the original cursor is still there as a cursor object, but now we have the data frame in Pandas that we can work with that's more interesting. And finally, you might see, instead of a cursor execute command, you might see a cursor fetch all. And fetch all is slightly different in the sense that it brings a list straight into. So what we get here is this is what comes out of the fetch all, which is a list of tuples. Remember, we had originally we were inserting into the database, we had the list of tuples. Well, if you use a fetch all, you get a list of tuples out of the database. So you can see we have our list here. It's in square brackets, and then we have the tuples inside there. So that would be equivalent to a row of our database. We can, of course, take that, and we know how to make a list of tuples into a data frame, and we sure heck can do that. We have our result here. We change it into our data frame, and sure enough, we can do the head to show that it all converted in, or we can print the whole thing out, and it's still there. So working with a database is really easy. If you use fetch all, it turns right into a Python list of tuples, which you can work with in many different ways, but really we want to get it into Pandas really quick, so we want to convert it into a data frame right away. For the most part, this is the really only select command you're going to need, SQL command you're going to need. You're going to select asterisk from, and then the table name. And you're probably going to be given the table name, or you can ask for what table you're going to be selecting from. You'll probably get more data than you need, but we know how to drop data in Pandas, so we'll be able to drop the fields we don't want rather than trying to select the exact fields we want here. A little less inefficient, but then you don't have to learn as much SQL. So if you need to learn any SQL, this is what you need to learn. Other than that, that's all you need to know about working with databases and Pandas.